Welcome to the Food Professor Podcast, presented by Cattle, Season 4, Episode 18. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm the Food Professor, Sylvain Charlebois.
Our special guest on this episode is Glenford Jameson, specializing in regulatory, commercial, and advertising law. Glenford is a trusted legal advisor in the food sector. It was a fascinating conversation. We could have had 3 more of them, actually. His expertise in both understanding the regulatory issues and then working with the CFIA and, what happens when you get dinged with stuff. It was a great conversation.
I know, yeah. As I was listening to him, I felt like I needed to pay tuition or something.
It's true. I think we got I don't know what he bills an hour, but it should be pretty high given his expertise, and we got it for free. You and the listeners. So listeners, you got a real treat coming up.
Want to save some money? Listen to Glenford.
Listen to the Food Professor podcast because we got the best guests. We get the best guests. And if you were listening closely, that's right. We are thrilled to announce that Cattle has come on board as our exclusive presenting sponsor of the Food Professor podcast. Isn't that great, Sylvain?
No,
fantastic
it's great.
news.
Yeah, it's the perfect marriage for us. Absolutely.
It's great. Now, for the listeners, you may have heard the Cattle name once or twice before, but let me tell you a little bit about Cattle. It's where brands and retailers thrive. Cattle is one of Canada's largest, most diverse, and daily active consumer panels. With over 10,000 daily active users, experience lightning fast collection and syndication of consumer reviews across every category and price range, and say goodbye to costly sampling and say hello to quick budget-friendly consumer insights and syndicated receipt data. Don't miss out. Anyway. We'll hear a little more from them. So we're thrilled to have them on board because it's very helpful to us to do more of what we do. It's a passion. It's all these great things, but having their support's really fantastic. All right.
Oh, it is. It is. And like I said, I mean, not only it's a great company, but there's some great people in that company. And so, as you know, Michael, I collaborate with Cattle all the time. We deliver webinars together. We use their data. It's always great. So I'm really thrilled to have them on board supporting our podcast.
Yeah, it'll allow us to do more of the great work that we do. So, all right, speaking of which, let's get right into the news. Dialing for discounters. Our Minister Champagne has been in the news with a raging interest in coaxing a foreign grocer into Canada. He also wrote a love letter about the grocers to the Competition Bureau. What do you make of all this? Political posturing from a government perhaps hopelessly behind in the polls, or genuine concern about food affordability in Canada? You know the minister, you know the issues, you know the policy. What are you thinking?
Oh yeah, he's generally concerned for sure. Now, how do you go about increasing competition in the country? There are different ways to do it. I'm not entirely convinced that dialing for dollars or dialing to get someone in Canada is the best way to go. In my view, if someone out there would see Canada as a good place to invest, they would have done it already. That's one thing. And secondly, I mean, we have to appreciate the fact that Canada is not a simple place to do business in. And I'm thinking about interprovincial barriers, different laws between provinces.
Physically big, not a lot of people. We got 40 million now, but I've described it as the diseconomy of scale, right? We are a vast nation.
Exactly. And grocers know that. And when your job is to sell food with very low margins, you have to care about these things. And so I don't know who's he calling and what is he talking about, but my guess is that the competition actually that we need actually exists right here in our own backyard. I mean, there are some players out there who can actually increase their food offering, in my view.
You've mentioned a couple of them, right? The giant tigers of the world, the
Dollarama,
the Dollaramas,
and frankly,
the C-stores, right? Couche-Tard,
is the knight in shining armor, in my view, that could actually pivot and do something really interesting in a grocery business. As far as I'm concerned, they actually did try to buy Carrefour, which is the 7th largest grocer in the world, and so why not invest in Canada? So I don't. And the other thing, I mean, in my view, and we've had this discussion before, the best way to increase competition in Canada is to implement a code of conduct. I actually do think, by bringing more discipline. Look at what happened in Australia. Aldi entered the market in 2001, so 22 years ago, But over time, things got really tight with Coles and Warworth. And because of the code, I think all of a sudden Lidl got interested in Australia and opened up its first store. I believe it was in 2020 or 2021.
Okay.
So you make the market more interesting if you change rules a little bit, making sure that independents have a larger say. And right now, it's really tough in Canada to survive as an independent.
And just to catch us all up on the code of conduct, I think the original schedule had something happening this spring-ish, like a final announcement. But where do we sit today? There's been some movement over the past.
I haven't heard anything. And just so you know, Michael, I was just invited yesterday to go back to Ottawa to testify before the Ag Committee about food price stabilization, whatever that means. And I'll be talking to some MPs, so I'll be asking that question for sure. What's going on with the code of conduct? I will be talking about the code of conduct once again, and because I'm a big believer in it. What can I say? I think it's important that we do something about this.
Okay, well, watch this space and listen to this podcast. We'll continue to update on that. Let's head over to Europe. So the farmers are in protest, they're blocking roads, they're dumping and throwing manure. Nothing new for French farmers anyway, but what are they all up in arms about?
Manure on the street, on people's houses. Oh my God.
Now we see the big pictures and we see, yeah, good one. Now, A, what are they all up in arms about? And B, should Canadian farmers start deploying the same tactics for the same reasons, or is our environment different? What do you make of all this?
I think, in Europe, Europe is a complicated place. You've been to Europe. I've lived in Europe for a while. It's complicated, and Europe feeds Europe, really, and so over the last, I'd say, a few decades, we've seen urban-centric governments making urban-centric decisions affecting food policies. And I'm not sure they really listen to farmers. Over time, we've seen more red tape, more costs, and revenues have barely changed. And as you know, farmers are price takers, so they feel suffocated in Europe right now. And which is why we've seen this movement affect over a dozen countries, and now it's in France. It's likely to reach Paris by the end of this week. It's troubling. Now, can we learn from what's going on in Europe here in Canada? I would say so. I actually do think that right now we do have an urban-centric government, which is not necessarily listening to farmers. Bill C. 234. I was
going to say, we saw some of that in the whole climate debate issue. Yep. How do you heat a barn at 40 below zero, right? Come out there, as you said, come on out to the center of the prairies and try to heat a barn and keep the animals healthy.
City dwellers will see farmers as polluters, not environmental stewards, which is totally flawed. Farmers need the land. They need Mother Nature to make a living. And so I think there's this distorted view of farming, but in my op-ed this week, I did write, there is a bit of difference between farmers and farming. People trust farmers. People love farmers. They're concerned about farming and practices, like the glyphosate situation.
Right. We'll talk about that a bit later.
The science is
GMOs. GMOs,
genetic engineering,
all that.
The use of herbicides, pesticides, a lot of interest groups funded by provinces and the federal government. They're out there advocating, getting city dwellers to think that a lot of these products are not good for farming. But in actuality, it's not necessarily the case. And so I think we've lost the will to debate on issues that are very rural, when in actuality, right now, as we speak, 1.6% of the Canadian population lives on farms. And so very few people understand farming in general.
So would you advocate the farmers do a little bit more, blocking of roads with tractors and or just become a little more politically active? I mean, what do you think? What do you think the key learnings out of the Europe situation are for our Canadian farmers and the listeners who are?
I certainly don't think that Canadians want something like what happened a few years ago with the truckers, for example. I don't think that's what we want, and frankly, I don't think that's what we need. But I do believe that Parliament needs to better listen to farmer groups. Now, when you say farmers, it's like in Europe, for example, you got so many different groups representing farmers. I mean, and they have different point of views. Some groups are pretty extreme. They think that everyone should be eating organic. So you got that group, but you also have groups that do represent farmers who trade and sell and feed the world, and they have a different view on agriculture, and so that's why it's been difficult in Canada to really listen to farmers. When you say listen to farmers, you need to appreciate that farming is just not a simple thing. It's complicated.
It's a wonderful point, because it's not, when we say farmers, it's not like they're one homogeneous unit. It's a very diversified group of individuals all coming at.
But at the end of the day, they're all price takers.
Yeah.
So as soon as you start making decisions that impacts costs, for example, they take a hit. And if you actually ask them to do more red tape, that's one less trip to the dentist. That's one less trip to the doctor. I mean, that's really the reality of farming is that. I mean, people live out there. So more red tape requires more work in an office where they're not making money. They're not making money filling out
or where they
forms.
need to charge more to the grocers, to the Canadians for their food products, right?
And
it all rolls
and they
up. They can't, yeah.
Or else they'll buy in Mexico.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's keep a close eye on that. Let's move to the other end, so to speak, of the spectrum. Let's talk about Metro. So Metro put out some quarterly results. Our friend Eric Lafresh and his great team. What did they say? They had solid results. Their discount food stores, particularly, are growing. Their Moi loyalty program. You've talked about the importance of loyalty program. 2.5 million members now. Fantastic. They've opened their new 600,000 square foot automated distribution. You talk about the necessary need for automation in Terrebonne. So employing people and robots, no doubt. And what was it? Sales up 6.5%, but their net earnings were down 1.1%. So putting it all together, what do I see? I see more emphasis on loyalty programs, more emphasis on their discount banners in these food affordability times, investment in technology, and sales up, profits flat to down. Am I got that right, or how did you read all that?
Yeah, I mean, overall, I think Metro is a well-managed organization. I think financial results are solid. If you're thinking about greedflation or profiteering, there's no evidence still. I mean, so the gross margin is actually down 0.3% from last year. So again, and when you look at food sales growth is actually lower than inflation. So all good. There's a couple of comments that Eric Lafleche made yesterday that irked me a little bit. End of the blackout period of 3 months, and prices are going to start rising again in February as a result of the end of the blackout period. And I'm going, man, read the room. Like, do you think people want to hear about the blackout period? And do you think that it's a practice that we still need to encourage in 2024 when it was created because grocers didn't want to deal with price changes over the holidays because you had to put prices on every single item? You don't have to do that anymore. I don't know about you, Michael, but I don't understand why we still have this blackout period. Like, why are we seeing this upstream price fixing? All grocers are asking suppliers to freeze prices. Why? And to me, price volatility is worse than food inflation. It's just worse.
Okay.
Yeah. And so an ideal scenario is to keep food inflation between 1.5 to 2.5% forever. That's the ideal scenario. It's never going to happen.
You got to tell that to the vendors too, right? I mean, it's a complicated dance between the grocers and the vendors. If they got to ask for those kind of increases as well, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And so I do think that at some point people will have to start asking questions about this blackout period. I actually raised the point with the Big Five and Minister Champagne and said, why are we still doing this? Like, seriously, tell me or tell Canadians this is actually helpful for them. And I'm still waiting.
Okay. Well, maybe it'll come out of your next meeting in the Ag, or we'll see. I
will raise the point next week in Ottawa for sure.
Right.
But who knows?
Let's take a quick break now and get to our interview with Glenford and hear a few words from our presenting sponsor, Cattle. Ever feel like the world of ratings and reviews needed a superhero? Well, enter Cattle, the caped crusader with Canada's largest, most diverse, and daily active consumer panels. That's right, Cattle is not your average podcast sponsor. They're like that cool friend who always knows the hottest trends. I mean, they are the voice of the consumer, after all. So why choose Cattle? Because Cattle excels in consumer insights from your consumer, while also blazing trails in the realm of ratings and reviews, pioneering the future landscape of user-generated content. Beyond valuable syndicated receipt data, they stand as unparalleled collector of reviews at scale, irrespective of category or price point, a testament to their impact, partnerships with giants like Walmart, Canadian Tire, and more. Visit AskCattle.com now for an exclusive The Food Professor podcast listener discount on your first review or research campaign today. That's AskCattle.com.
Joining us this week is Glenford Jameson, who I believe is one of the best regulatory experts out there right now. So I'm really glad that he has some time to join us this week. So welcome to the podcast, Glenford.
Thanks, Sylvain. You can't see me, but I'm blushing. That's so kind. It's a treat to finally be on and
that's
get
right.
to share sort of the legal insight into a show that's focused on sort of consumer behavior and regulatory trends. We float in the ether amongst those conversations very quietly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I forgive me if I'm wrong, Michael, but I don't think we've ever had a lawyer joining us for the podcast in the last 4 or 5 years. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, we've had folks who deal with regulation like associations. Of course, we've had the Minister of Agriculture, but we've never had an expert who works in the important details and more importantly, the intent of some of the laws. I think it would be great for the listeners. So we really appreciate you joining us.
I mean, Glenford, you're well known in the industry, but still, some people may not know you. So talk to us a little bit about yourself, your professional journey, and where do you live and what do you do?
Sure. So I'm based out of Toronto. I practice across Canada, and I started a law firm devoted to food law 11 years ago, almost 11 years ago this March. If you want to go way back, I worked in kitchens and in hospitality a lot. My first job was making bacon bits and washing dishes before I had a social insurance number. And let me tell you, child labor laws are ruining this country. I worked as a server, worked as a wine steward, really got into to wine when I was, honestly, like in my late teens, early 20s. Sort of getting into sort of the European sort of denominations and appellations, I thought was really interesting. Did an undergrad in history, economics, and poli-sci at Mount Allison University. Worked at a law firm for 2 years that did high-end estates and family matters. I worked on a divorce that took 20 years to settle and decided I had wanted nothing to do with family law, or as the leading partner said, the dead and depressed. I went to law school with a view to and I found I had a knack for sort of business and business issues primarily. I went to law school at Dalhousie, which was great. I wrote probably a pretty bad paper on highly perishable products in the international trade context and insurance issues that come up.
And what year was that?
Oh God, that would have been 2009. Maybe 2010, articled at a Bay Street firm. They had these great clients that had really sophisticated regulatory needs in the food and CPG space. And then they had really complex commercial issues that flowed therefrom. And I thought, this is so cool. This is great. This is like, I have this interest in this area, generally both business law and then also in sort of the food space. It would be so neat to focus a practice on this. And they weren't super interested in that, but they certainly helped me start my own practice. Worked on a startup that totally failed and then opened the doors in 2013. And that was a long time ago. And so today what we do is we sort of do two classic silos of work. And so half of what I do is regulatory law. And regulatory law sort of takes two different forms for me. I mean, we deal with stuff on the front end, so compliance and claims, a lot of ad and marketing work, novel food applications, licensing things, stuff like that, trying to assess, is there a risk, that sort of thing. And then a lot of work on the back end. And the back end is enforcement actions, so seizures and detentions, administrative monetary penalties or ministerial reviews to a degree, recalls. We spend a lot of time working on recalls. And then the other half of our practice is commercial in nature. And so it's taking all that know-how and applying it to agreements, right? So you're a food brand, you want to sell it to a distributor. Well, what happens in the context of a recall, right? What kind of insurance do we need in place? What's this going to cost? Can we make these claims? Maybe we're working for the distributor and the food business is making aggressive claims. And we can sort of stop and say, well, look, I'm not sure this is a food. This might be a natural health product or a supplemented food, which has a different framework. And so we want to make sure that we're compliant on that end. And then on the back end, it's trying to navigate blame, that sort of thing.
Right. You cover, so basically both ends of the food continuum almost. You don't necessarily spend most of your time with distribution. You look at processing, different elements of the supply chain, correct?
That's right. I mean, it's really, my job is weird but fun. I just gave an interview on at the airport Toronto Hilton. A diner was presented with a waiver after ordering a medium rare hamburger. And so I give interviews on stuff like that. But the joy of my job is that we sort of go up and down the food value chain. I mean, all the way through to waste. I mean, something that's been really interesting for us over the last 2 years is packaging has become scrutinized, right? And so now we're thinking about plastics recovery and sort of circular issues in terms of waste creation and regeneration, right? And so we're going past sort of primary agriculture, which we do a little bit of, and then processing. We're in Ontario, so we do a lot of that. Distribution, a little bit of retail, not much hospitality. We do some work with users and with user groups. Volunteered a lot of time with Oceana, for example. A pet project of mine is always working on food fraud and transparency, and then all the way through to waste. So from soup to nuts, that's our purview.
The Hilton Airport situation with the waiver, that was an interesting case. So I just, since you've mentioned it, what's your take on what happened there at the hotel when someone is served a medium rare hamburger, gets a waiver from the restaurant, acknowledging risks. So as a lawyer, what's your take on that?
I mean, it's fascinating generally. I guess just a starting point, we look at it. You can't
waiver your way. Yeah. And as I understand it, you can't waiver your way out of negligence, right? I mean, waivers only have set limitations.
Well, right? I mean, so we got two. So we sort of have 4 different universes here, right? We're next. I mean, everything that happens in Canada, whether we like it or not, sovereign nation, et cetera, is cast in the shadow of what happens in the United States. And the United States is a country that likes a lot of disclosure on menus, right? So if you go to almost any hospitality eating establishment in the U.S., there will be something on the bottom of the menu that says, hey, unless otherwise directed, we cook our things to X, and there are maybe some allergens in the kitchen. Please inform your server, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the concept legally is everything that comes out of the kitchen has an implied warranty, right? It is safe to eat. And if you're asking us to derogate from our standards, then you're taking on that risk. And we accept that, right? In sort of a commercial sense. And in the US, more litigious than Canada, we see class actions in a way we don't in Canada, particularly related to consumer products. But we see a lot of personal responsibility and the ability to sort of take off in that universe. Whereas from a regulatory standpoint, we don't see the same thing. I mean, in the US, certainly there are public health agencies that are local. We see lots of sort of the equivalent of, in Toronto, we have DineSafe. In LA and New York, you see sort of letter number grades in terms of the cleanliness of a restaurant, that sort of thing. But they're, I think, a little bit less invasive than Canadian regulators in the US. And so a lot of it's on the customer. This is an airport Hilton, sort of based out of the US, and a place where, I mean, and you'll know this, in food, everything is about process, right? And so we want to do the same thing the same way every time. This is the brilliance of fast food and McDonald's in a lot of ways.
Now, if I recall correctly, Glenford, the airport, the Hilton Airport, was the exact same hotel where we both you and I met for the food safety conference.
I thought about that too. Absolutely. And you know what? I mean, they serve a fine lunch, but yeah, absolutely. But look, I mean, so like their internal processes are going to say like, you're going to do things in a way that's safe, right? There is a health concern with chuck, like with ground meat. They're going to want it cooked to a certain degree. The feds have an idea of how it should be cooked, and the provincial authority under the Health Protection Promotion Act, they also have guidelines in terms of internal temperatures, right? And so any entity has obligations to their consumers in a civil law basis, right? Negligence, will I get sued? And Michael, to your question, informed consent can play a role there, right? Look, I understand I'm taking on this risk. If I get sick, that's on me, right? But there's this second universe, which is regulatory in nature, which is like, look, you have to prove to us that you're making food in a way that's safe. And if you fail to do that, then you may lose your license and that sort of thing. And so does a waiver really work in the Canadian context? I mean, like, generally speaking, at a very high level, not legal advice, blah, blah, blah. We're not really looking at a whole lot of risk from people who get foodborne illnesses, right? Like the province typically has sick days built into a person's job. You're not going to lose it typically for not showing up for a couple of days if you're ill, as long as you're not, sort of under 5.
I guess the fundamental question for our listeners, I mean, do you think, Glenford, based on what you're seeing, should we expect more of these things as consumers? Should we expect more restaurant operators to do this?
Well, like I don't. I mean, so it's not part of the culture here, right? So I think that. And that's what's so striking about it. It's so unusual. And then, I mean, from a business perspective, like, I don't know what your appetite's like after someone serves you some legal papers, but generally it's not very high.
I was just going to say, right? Really, so it impacts the experience, I can tell you.
Yeah, I think the diner might walk away from that and say, I maybe cook this all the way, or maybe if you're so worried about this, then we should get a burger somewhere else. And so I have a hard time imagining that it's going to be co-opted in some ways. But I mean, a lot of restaurant practices, in a historical way, have sat apart from a lot of local food safety guidelines. For a long time, up until maybe the mid-2010s in Ontario, or Toronto at least, Ontario, you couldn't make mayonnaise or aioli or those sort of group of sauces from eggs in the shell. There was a concern about salmonella. And so in every high-end restaurant, in the kitchen, there was an open box of pasteurized eggs in the fridge, so that if an inspector came by, you would say like, oh, no. We would never make the aioli out of these heritage breed eggs that we managed to procure. We would make them out of these pasteurized eggs. Don't worry about it. And then presumably the inspector would leave and they'd go back to making really, really nice aioli, the way that it's sort of intended to be made.
We often hear that the food industry is highly regulated compared to other sectors. I don't know if you agree on that or not, but I mean, your job is to look at regulations and regulatory challenges. What are some of the challenges that are really keeping you busy these days?
Oh, well, I mean, as a starting point, there seems to be this unending sea of change. We had the Safe Food for Canadians Act come in 2019 with sort of a staggered series of licenses. And that has been heavy duty legislation for everyone to try and adjust to, and to try and understand how it was going to be interpreted by the regulator, by businesses. There were lots of consultants, a sort of cottage industry of folks who were former inspectors who'd created documents and traceability documents and safety documents. And so now we're starting to see how that's being understood and being dealt with and being enforced. And so that's one piece. But we've got lots of challenges. I mean, one is we have this obligation under most of our trade agreements to remain in step with our trading partners. But we managed to hold on to some real non-tariff barriers to trade, one of which that creates a lot of problems for clients of ours. And 60% of what I do is international in nature, right? So trying to bring products into Canada, trying to manage those products once they're in Canada is the flour enrichment standard, which is different than the Mexican one and is different than a couple that are, I mean, the UK, I believe, has one, and then some in Eastern Europe have. And so if you are making a lot of things that involve even the tiniest amount of flour, like even so little flour that you couldn't actually get the blend of vitamins, right? It needs to be enriched. And so you'll tell that to clients and they'll be like, oh, okay. It'll cost us a fortune to create a second line for Canada. And we can't sort of blend it in with other countries. And so maybe we just won't sell this there. And then one of their staff members will go to, a market that serves a particular community, and they'll be like, hey, like I went to this Italian shop in Vaughan and all of our competitors are there and they don't have any reference to niacin or iron or riboflavin or any of these things on their labels. Like, could they just be bringing this in without enriching it? It's like, well, yeah, definitely. It's like, well, has anyone ever been, sort of pinched for this? And you're like, yeah, well, it happens. It doesn't happen very often, but it happens. And you're like, well, what are we supposed to do with this, right? And so that's something that's really challenging and really frustrating for a lot of our international trading partners.
I imagine, yeah.
Yeah, and flour often isn't like the main show, right? Like we've got some products that use sort of flour as like the initial building block of whatever you're actually trying to put together. I mean, flour can sort of show up in all kinds of different products. Another example would be how we cure things, right? So to say that something is cured in Canada, it means it needs to have, I don't have this in front of me, but something between 200 and 400 parts per million of nitrates. And those nitrates, they go into the impasto, as we call it in Italian, but sort of like meat slurry or sausage. And then over the course of curing, it dissipates, precipitates into different salts, and sort of goes away. In the European Union, things can be cured somehow with zero nitrates, and so they don't create a floor for it. And so we have clients that bring in really high-end, beautiful cured meats, and we get asked for not the certificate of analysis for like what's in the meat right now. We get asked for what was in the meat when it was going to be cured. And if it doesn't have enough nitrates in it, then it can't be cured meat in Canada. And so it creates sort of like weird tensions and weird problems. And I'm not saying that like we should all be harmonized around the world, but some things like that do cause headaches.
I mean, your job is to interpret regulations and make sure that your customers are compliant. And I'll throw a question to you before I asked Mike to take over here. But you do interact a lot with Health Canada and the CFIA, and they are criticized quite a bit, whether it's by experts or in the media. Is that criticism fair, do you think, towards Health Canada and CFIA? And if not, convince people listening to us that, these people are...
This is a great question. It's so
I know,
good.
I know you have an opinion on this, so I certainly want to hear it.
So first off, Health Canada and the CFIA take up most of my days, and in like a really great way. Health Canada, of course, develops policy and does some enforcement. They do a lot of the heavy lifting relating to science, and then they're overseen by the Minister of Health. And then CFIA is like this mammoth organization that is just like, it's impossible to overstate how large it is.
People don't know how big it is, eh?
It's like
most Canadians have no idea.
You're right. I mean, Sylvain, like they oversee feeds and fertilizers and seeds and product labeling and some elements of the criminal code sometimes and the Competition Act. The Bureau is delegated food issues to them, and like it just kind of goes. So they deal with a ton, and so we meet lots of people in that agency. And I would say, just as a starting point, I'm going to say a bunch of really nice things. CFIA, I mean, their management side are unbelievable. Like really, there are some extraordinary people working and trying to make sense of the laws and regulations they have in front of them. And that's not an easy job. And the second thing is they're constantly figuring out what to enforce in a sea of laws and regulations. Like you go into the food and drug regs and you've got hundreds of pages of things, right? And not everything is going to be enforced. They've got a limited budget and they have to try and triage. What do we care about more? Do we care about whether there's enough protein in this processed chicken product, or do we care whether this chicken product has colony forming units of, you name it, that might put someone in a hospital? Like, it's like pretty straightforward, right, in terms of triaging. And that's really complex. And then on the ground level, honestly, and I mean, I say this as a fairly privileged person. I'm sitting here in my basement today. Generally speaking, don't get my hands too dirty, and I speak a little aggressively on the phone from time to time. But like, being a frontline CFIA inspector is a tough job. And there are a lot of really smart people who have taken that job. We see a lot of vets who didn't find a home in veterinary. That become, sort of people who oversee meat plants. And you just sort of picture yourself. It's like, okay, so you go to school, you get a couple degrees, you live in rural Canada somewhere, you grab a job at a meat processing facility. It's cold. It's not terribly pleasant in there. You're seeing animals slaughtered. You're seeing them processed. And you basically have to stand there with a notebook and try and figure out, what people did wrong. Like, for me, I just think that would be a very difficult job. And on top of that, candidly, I don't think you're paid terribly well to do that. And like, the market sorts that out. They had a problem finding people. More recently, they're doing better at hiring. But that's tough. And then the last piece, we don't appreciate what we have until we sort of look around the globe around us. And in Canada, the CFIA has an unbelievable reputation internationally. Like, when I get on calls with people from Australia, Japan, Germany, Italy, the US. We had a client from the US recently who'd said, we have a plant in Canada, and we have a plant in Canada because we can stamp things with this additive that they create here. As CFIA inspected, we get to charge a premium for that because it's a trusted mark. And so that means something. And this is for clients who are, governed by the USDA and the FDA. Like, that's no joke either. They're seen as a science-based agency, and that's often a huge concern. And this is something that you and I get into as Canadians, but like, internationally, they're seen as generally making decisions on the basis of science as opposed to politics. And so all of that, I think, is extraordinary. On the ground, things that make me nuts are the exact same things that I just forgave them for, right? Which is like, you know what? Like, sometimes inspectors on the ground who are facing grueling working circumstances and conditions make really poor decisions. And that causes a phone call to me, and then I have to clean up a mess, and then management gets involved, and then the access to information complaint comes like a year later, and then we're trying to figure out, what is a trade secret or not, and what is private and what is not. And so it creates an enormous piece, right? And so, like, would it be better if there were no bad decisions? Yeah, for sure. But it's like if we could clone a bunch of like Sylvain Charlebois and like fire them into all of these plants, and it's like, that would be a terrible answer to this problem. But it would. Michael laughs. But it would still, it would be a really grueling piece, and then you would see difficult decisions come out of that, right? And so at a high level, it's extraordinary. And then the piece that I find most difficult is, what we sort of see every day, which is there are some laws and regulations that are enforced and some that aren't. You drive 120, as a matter of policy in the city of Toronto, if you drive 11 kilometers over the speed limit, the police will not stop you for a ticket. Like, that is in a document somewhere, or at least it was. Right. And so in Canada with CFIA, those things are sort of built in as well. And it's not always obvious, which are going to be enforced, which aren't. And often with CFIA, they respond to complaints, and every complaint that they receive, so long as it has an air of reality to it, is followed up on. And so often you'll have these laws that you almost regard as zombie laws, like they're really not enforced. No one's asking questions, not a priority. And then suddenly it'll be like, hey, someone found some insects in these figs. And you go, well, of course they did. That's how they pollinate. And they're like, well, we think there are too many. And so they're going to dust off the methods manual for how to determine if there's too much foreign or extraneous material in figs. And you get to go through that process, which is not very much fun.
As I listen to you and reflect on what you're saying, it's super interesting. Now, we have an audience that is made up of people who are large multinational organizations with tremendous resources. They might have a compliance person, they might have an in-house counsel or whatever, access to people like you. But we also have a lot of small indie entrepreneurs, kind of like yourself, in the startup area. And if you could wrap that discussion we just had on regulatory compliance and even enforcement into, is there any common 1, 2, or 3 things that you would say to the audience that are kind of regulatory compliance issues that you should, no matter what, understand or comply with? It's a tough question because I understand that there's a lot of written black letter law, but then there's the intent behind the code and all those things. But is there any kind of, listen, if you can only do these things, start here. Not if you can only do these things, but start here with these 1 or 2 things, and you'll generally be on the right side of compliance as we understand it today.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, sort of 65% of my time is spent with MNEs, right? So like really large organizations, and I'll get a memo from Milan or Luxembourg that'll be scrutinized by sort of like 5 or 10 lawyers before I get it, trying to figure out a problem in Canada, and I'll try and solve that. And then the other like 35% of it is like is a person who's like, hey, I've created this thing. I think it's really great. I want to build it. And I'm not sure really how to go about it. Like, do I need an NDA? Do I need protection? That sort of thing. And so we see both. And so the first thing I'd say is that Canada is not the United States, and Canada is not Europe. While some things may align generally, like there are some real oddities here. And those oddities relate to, I think, virtually everything. I mean, during the plant-based explosion, sort of over the last 5 years, moving from sort of like really strange labeling conventions to something now that's a little bit more sort of normative and aligned with what we see in the U.S. We saw lots of interesting problems relating to fortification. Right, in Canada, if something is a simulated meat product, it needs to have sort of the same nutrient value as a meat product. And so there's this question over like, well, is it a simulated meat product or not? Would you be confused with that? In the U.S.,
some of that might get to branding too, right? I mean, we've talked on one example about oat and almond. These can't be called milks. At one time, they were called milks, right? And that was more kind of not a compliance, but more kind of a consumer protection. But then we're very intrigued by the whole lab-grown meat. And that there's some legislation in the States that said, well, you can't call it meat if it's grown in a lab. These are pretty interesting issues along that through line, yeah?
Incredibly interesting. And I guess, I mean, to answer the original question, like what happens in the U.S. is not what's going to happen here. And like trying to follow what's happening in the U.S. where, I mean, we think about like that milk process. If you, really dig into it, there's this fascinating path of dairy industry class actions, right? So finding a lead claimant to say they were misled by how an almond milk or an oat milk or what have you, muscle milk, who knows, was in that product. And then you've got a countersuit, and then you've got lawsuits involving the FDA, trying to get the FDA to make a decision for them. Like that exists in such a different realm than in what happens in Canada, right? In Canada,
more litigious, right? They're more litigious. It feels like they're more regulatory, more detailed regulatory. It's a very complex environment in Europe, and more litigious in America, and we're somewhere in between. Does that sound about right?
I mean, sort of. Like the U.S. counterexample is great because we have a regulator that will talk to us, right? Like I fight with CFIA and Health Canada all day, and I'm just going to say nice things about them today, which feels strange. But like you look at the food labeling tool for industry, and it's not always coherent, and sometimes there's conflicting information, and it changes, and you can see when the pages are updated. So I can see when I've had a problem, and then it's resulted in changes in terms of interpretation. But it is this incredible source of information for companies, and then when they follow up on a complaint, they'll reach out to you and say, "Hey, like this is cashew product and our cashew cheese," and it's like, "Well, let's have a negotiation about this, right?" And it's like, "Is it?" I can't remember. I'm thinking of the Blue Goose example, where it's this is 100% dairy-free, non-dairy, not cheese, like cashew cheese, right? And they're like, "Okay, fine. No one's going to be confused with that. Let's go." And so you compare that to hashing this out in the courts. And then actually having to, bring a motion or bring a lawsuit to try and get FDA to take a position. We're really lucky here. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing. it does result in a very different process. It looks very foreign to U.S. manufacturers in particular, but also to manufacturers from the EU, who, I mean, often don't have their minds turned to a lot of these issues. I mean, plant-based is certainly front and center for EU, and they're coming up to some elections that I think are going to really shake the boat there this year. But in Canada, in that regard, it's an extraordinary thing. And so the difficult piece is, so we can talk to them, we can reach out, we can often get a response. Sometimes it's not very timely. Sometimes it's done in a somewhat casual manner, so it's difficult to figure out if you can rely on it. Sometimes it's not consistent, so it depends on who you get from CFIA or Department of Justice Council. And so those are problems. But generally speaking, it's a really wonderful thing. But for MNEs and smaller enterprises, what do you want to get right? That's your core question. I think the answer is, you know what? You got to figure out really quickly what your food is. Is it a food? Is it a natural health product? Is it a drug? Is it a supplemented food? That's step one. Got to do that. And really ask yourself critically, what category does this fit in? Because they all have different rules. And then once you do that, each framework will have an obligation on you to prepare a bunch of documents. You got to have a preventative control plan in place. You're probably going to have a license if it's a food and you're bringing it in to Canada. There's going to be, controls in terms of ensuring that the labels are compliant and that it's traceable. Where are you selling this stuff? Where did you get it? Right? And so for me, from a regulatory perspective, making sure that you've got those documents together, that's step one. And it's been really interesting. The CFIA has started to enforce. It's sort of taken off this gentle introductory period with the Safe Food for Canadians Act, which again was implemented 4.5 years ago. And now they're starting to ask lots of people who didn't traditionally experience a lot of proactive regulation, hey, where are your documents? And I'll get calls.
Interesting.
That's
hey,
right.
they're asking me for documents. I've never met a CFIA inspector before in my life. What do we do? They're going to be here in 3 days.
This is brand new.
Well, you better get some. You better get some documents ready. Let's start.
You guys
drafting,
actually meant that. You meant that.
Well, I think that's how CFI looks at it, Sylvain. But I think that, for these guys, they're this is meat plants get regulated like this.
This has just been a fantastic discussion. So where we can find more information about your services, what you do, and the support you provide to help our food industry?
For sure. So my law firm is called GS Jameson and Company. It's gsjameson.com. But if you just type in Food Lawyer Canada, there are probably 20 of us across the country. So I'll be on there somewhere if you type it into Google. And then I'm part of an organization. I'm a director, and I helped co-found it, the Canadian Association for Food Law and Policy. And we're doing some cool stuff with some academics and some practicing lawyers and some NGOs and decision makers, which is kind of cool. I'm also part of the Excellence Manufacturing Consortium as a partner in sort of thought leadership, and we do work with them. We do work closely with Alberta Ag, who are putting on some really cool content. We're recommended counsel with the Good Food Institute out of DC, who advise plant-based cellular ag companies, and so we do regulatory pathway work on that, precision fermenting, that sort of thing. And a member of the European Food Law Association, which are a great group of humans, and we get into all kinds of no good.
Well, listen, it's a lot of great and a great way to get a hold of you. We're going to get you back on the pod because we haven't even talked about food safety yet, which is kind of a big deal for us.
I know.
On the pod.
Exactly.
I think that's 2.5 episodes of entire content. But for now, Glenford, thanks so much for joining Sylvain and I on the Food Professor podcast. It's been a real treat to meet you and to hear the perspectives. I think it's very important to each and every listener in one way, shape, or another. So thanks for making time for us and continued success and have a great rest of your week.
Well, this content is super important for Canadians. And so thank you for doing it. And thanks for having me. This is so fun.
All right. Last couple of things. Bayer's AG $2 billion fine. You wrote something about Monsanto and the different glycosins. You mentioned it earlier. And what's going on with this fine, and why do you think it's good, bad? I think you don't like it for some reason. What are you thinking here?
Well, so first of all, do you think any human being deserves to be compensated $2.2 billion? Don't you think it's a lot?
It's a lot.
It's one person. One person is getting $2.2 billion.
Jeez. How much? Hey, we should ask Glenford. What do you think the lawyer fees are getting? Maybe a percentage of that. That's a pretty good deal. Jeez.
It's a pretty good deal. But I mean, and there are 55,000 cases pending in the U.S. It is not over. Oh, yeah. So it's
so what is so okay? So for the listeners who aren't following this, which is probably most of them, what was the fine about, and what was it for?
Well, so in 2015, the World Health Organization actually categorized glyphosate, which is the main ingredient for Roundup, which is the product and the brand owned by Monsanto, which was actually acquired by Bayer A&G in 2014, I believe. That ingredient was deemed potentially cancerous. Okay,
right. As a consumer, you cannot buy Roundup today, right, in Canada. I think is the case.
In most unless you have a commercial license or
right.
there are exceptions, but as a consumer, like a personal consumer, you can't walk into
right.
And so that's one thing. Now, since then, we've seen over 165,000 cases of people accusing Monsanto of causing them cancer, essentially.
165,000 cases?
Yeah. So about 110,000 were dismissed now, have been dismissed for a variety of reasons, but we still have about 50,000. And this latest case, well, this person won, but it was a jury was involved of peers. And of course, they will see the political aspect of glyphosate. And a lot of groups are well organized, convincing people that this is really bad for them, bad for the environment, bad for everything. And they've been successful. The reason why they've been successful at is that for many years, and glyphosate is 50 years old this year, by the way. It's been commercialized for 50 years. Since 1974. And in those days, they never bothered explaining to the public what was going on. And they're paying for it today. And so that information void was filled by groups just telling people, you know what, this is bad. You're not in control of food systems. We should condemn the use of this product, and that's it. So that's basically what's going on right now. And
so in your mind, does this get back to the kind of the urban farmer versus, the rural farmer versus the urban agendas? Is this kind of a good example of what we were talking about earlier? You can't. Exactly. It's hard to raise. We talked about actually on our episode with Ontario Genomics for Bettini. She was saying, listen, a lot of this work is on pest control because pests and climate change are coming north, right? They're not dying out, right?
Well, so there were two major cases. The latest one last week. These are urban gardeners using glyphosate. They did use Roundup, but the volume was insignificant compared to farmers out there using thousands and thousands of gallons of that stuff, and
on thousands of acres of land.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're not accusing. They're not prosecuting, or they're not suing Monsanto for their cancer. So you can tell that there's a lot of politics involved. And my concern to me is, so on genetic engineering, the horse has left the barn. Okay. We lost I think Monsanto, Bayer, and the biotechs lost the risk perception or the risk communication game. They just lost it. So we're gonna
or ignored it. I mean, they never came to play. Is kind of, by the sounds of it, your point. Right?
Well, they tried early 2000s because they saw that, my goodness, people hate us. Why? And they started to do something, but it was too late. Now with gene editing being approved since last year, can we not screw it up again? Can we do something? Can we actually communicate to the public what gene editing is? It's just been approved last year.
Yeah, I see how you're connecting those dots. Yeah, I see now. Yeah,
yeah. Okay. And a lot of people will say, well, gene editing is like genetic engineering. So here we go again.
Yeah.
Here we go again. That's my concern.
Okay. All right. I thank you for that. I kind of understand a lot better now. And hopefully we're playing some small role. We get guests on, talk about all these things.
Exactly.
So I'm coming to you live from San Juan, Puerto Rico, actually, if I sound a little different. And I was doing a
smell
keynote.
The palm trees.
It is a beautiful place.
Yes.
Beautiful place, beautiful people, so nice. And I was doing a bit of a keynote on the future of restaurants. And one of the things I talked about is Ozempic Nation. So we've talked about this on the show. I wanted to give you this fun factoid. So the association I'm here with, the great RSPA, I'm on the board, and they're based in North Carolina, just kind of where they're based. So I went and did this research. Listen to this. In June 2021, this is according to the New York Times, the insurance plan for North Carolina, the great state of North Carolina, employees was paying for 2,800 people to take weight loss drugs, right? June 2021, 2,800 people. Last year, 2023, it was paying for 25,000 employees of the great state of North Carolina, Wegovy, costing the North Carolina State Health Plan $100 million last year, 10% of all spending on prescription drugs. So my call out to the folks in the audience was, if you are representing restaurants in North Carolina, there are now 25,000 people who will not go to fast food restaurants based on the fact that they're having this. So anyway, we've talked about this.
You're talking about GLP-1 drugs, right?
That's okay. Right. So, and as we've talked about it kind of eliminates this impulse. It certainly eliminates your need for your hunger for food. So,
eating, yeah.
Right. You're still going to eat, but you're probably not going to, oh, geez, I think I'll get a cola and a burger just because I'm suddenly hungry, right? Like, you're not hungry anymore. So anyway, just to kind of update the people and the listeners on these numbers that are just starting to add up. I mean, you can't get Ozempic practically in Canada. It's sold out. So that's a bit of supply and demand nonsense. But anyway, I just wanted to update you and the listeners.
25,000.
25,000 from 2,300 in 2 years.
That's a decent sized town.
Right. And this is just the state of North Carolina, not the biggest state in the union. Great state, but not the biggest state in the union. I wanted to finish off with some great news, as I always kind of try to do, as we always kind of try to do. Loblaws announced charitable giving fund of $1 million for 5 different organizations serving historically unrepresented members of the Canadian communities. By the way, Minister, Canadian government, if you're listening to this, I hope you're asking on that phone call to these foreign retailers that they're going to have to do the same thing, that they're also going to have to come with money for Canadians. And it goes to, just quickly, I'll put a link in the show notes, Black Business Professional Association, Canadian Women's Foundation, Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital, Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, and Pride at Work Canada. $1 million. Congratulations to
That's incredible.
Loblaw.
Thank you to Loblaws. And by the way, I mean, Loblaws,
right.
Again, a call to Minister Champagne, if you you ever get a grocer into the Canadian market, Loblaws, Metro, and Sobeys are our biggest partners at Second Harvest. And I'm on the board of Second Harvest, and we get a lot of food from them. So if you actually are thinking of joining Canada, think of our non-for-profits, food banks, and food rescuing agencies, please.
That's it for today's show, presented by Cattle. I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer growth consultant, podcaster, and a bunch of other things. And you are?
And I'm Sylvain Chalabois, the food professor.
All right, everybody. Talk to you next week. Safe travels, and thanks for tuning in.
Take care.